I'm back. So it says, never and never, my girl riding far and near, in the land of the hearthstone tales and spelled asleep. Fear or believe that the wolf in the sheep white hood, loping and bleating roughly and blithely shall leap, my dear, out of a lair in the flocked leaves in the dew dipped year, to eat your heart in the house in the rosy wood. There was a moment of silence, and Matilda, who had never before heard great romantic poetry spoken aloud, was profoundly moved. "It's like music," she whispered. "It is a music," Miss Honey said, and then, as though embarrassed at having revealed such a great secret part of herself, she quickly pushed open the gate and walked up the path. Matilda hung back. She was a bit frightened of this place now. It seemed so unreal and remote and fantastic and so totally away from this earth. It was like an illustration in Grimm or Hans Andersen. It was the house where the poor woodcutter lived with Hansel and Gretel, and where Red Riding Hood's grandmother lived, and it was also the house of the 7 dwarfs and the 3 bears and all the rest of them. It was straight out of a fairy tale. "Come along, my dear," Miss Honey called back, and Matilda followed her up the path. The front door was covered with flaky green paint, and there was no keyhole. Miss Honey simply lifted the latch and pushed open the door and went in. Although she was not a tall woman, she had to stoop low to get through the doorway. Matilda went after her and found herself in what seemed to be a dark, narrow tunnel. "You can come through to the kitchen and help me make the tea," Miss Honey said, and she led the way along the tunnel into the kitchen. That is, if you could call it a kitchen. It was not much bigger than a good-sized clothes cupboard, and there was one small window in the back wall with a sink under the window, but there were no taps over the sink. Against another wall was a shelf, presumably for preparing wood, and there was a single cupboard above the shelf. On the shelf itself there stood a Primus stove, saucepan, and half-full bottle of milk. A Primus is a little camping stove that you fill with paraffin, and you light it at top, and then you pump it to get pressure for the flame. "You can get me some water while I light the Primus," Miss Honey said. "The well is out the back. Take the bucket. Here it is. You'll find a rope in the well. Just hook the bucket onto the end of the rope and lower it down but don't fall in yourself, Matilda." Matilda, more bemused than ever now, took the bucket and carried it out into the back garden. The well had a little wooden roof over it and a simple winding device, and there was the rope dangling down into a dark bottomless hole. Matilda pulled up the rope and hooked the handle of the bucket onto the end of it. Then she lowered it until she heard a splash and the rope went slack. She pulled it back up, and lo and behold, there was water in the bucket. "Is this enough?" she asked, carrying it in. "Just about," Miss Honey said. "I don't suppose you've ever done that before." "Never," Matilda said. "It's fun. How did you get enough water for your bath?" "I don't take a bath," said Miss Honey. "I wash standing up. I get a bucket full of water and I heat it on the stove, and I strip and wash myself all over." "Do you honestly do that?" Matilda asked. "Of course I do," Miss Honey said. "Every poor person in England used to wash that way until not so very long ago, and they didn't have a Primus. They had to heat the water over the fire in the hearth." "Are you poor, Miss Honey?" "Yes," Miss Honey said. "Very. It's a good little stove, isn't it?" The Primus was roaring away with a powerful blue flame, and already the water in the saucepan was beginning to bubble. Miss Honey got a teapot from the cupboard and put some tea leaves into it. She also found a small loaf of brown bread. She cut 2 thin slices, and then, from a plastic container, she took some margarine and spread it on the bread. Margarine, Matilda thought. She really must be poor. Miss Honey found a tray, and on it she put 2 mugs, the teapot, the half bottle of milk, and a plate with 2 slices of bread. "I'm afraid I don't have any sugar," she said. "I never use it." "That's all right," Matilda said. In her wisdom, she seemed to be aware of the delicacy of the situation, and she was taking great care not to say anything to embarrass her companion. "Let's have it in the sitting room," Miss Honey said, picking up the tray and leading the way out of the kitchen and down the dark tunnel into the room at the front. Matilda followed her, but just inside the doorway of the so-called sitting room she stopped, and stared. Oh, that's not focusing. She stared around in absolute amazement. The room was as small and square as a pair, and as bare as a prison cell. The pale daylight that entered came from a single tiny window in the front wall, but there were no curtains. The only objects in the entire room were two upturned wooden boxes to serve as chairs, and a third box between them for a table. That was all. There was no pictures on the wall, no carpet on the floor, only rough, unpolished wooden planks, and there were gaps between the planks where dust and bits of grime had gathered. The ceiling was so low that, with a jump, Matilda could nearly touch it with her fingertips. The walls were white, but the whiteness didn't look like paint. Matilda rubbed her palm against it, and the white powder came off of her skin. It was whitewash, the cheap stuff that is used in cowsheds and stables and then hen houses. Matilda was appalled. Was this really where her neat and trimly dressed schoolteacher lived? Was this all she had to come back to after a day's work? It was unbelievable, and what was the reason for it? There was something very strange going around her, surely. Miss Honey put the tray on one of the upturned boxes. "Sit down, my dear, sit down," she said, "and we'll have a nice hot cup of tea. Help yourself to bread. Both slices are for you. I never eat anything when I get home. I have a good old tuck-in at the school lunch, and that keeps me up going until the next morning." Matilda perched herself carefully on an upturned box, and more out of politeness than anything else, she took a slice of bread and margarine and started to eat it. At home she would have been having buttered toast and strawberry jam and probably a piece of sponge cake to round it off, and yet this was somehow far more fun. There was a mystery here in this house, a great mystery. There was no doubt about that, and Matilda was longing to find out what it was. Miss Honey poured the tea and added a little milk to both cups. She appeared to be not in the least ill at ease sitting on an upturned box in a bare room and drinking tea out of a mug that she balanced on her knee. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking very hard about what you did with that glass. It's a great power you have been given, my child. You know that?" "Yes, Miss Honey, I do," Matilda said, chewing her bread and margarine. "So far as I know," Miss Honey went on, "nobody else in the history of the world has been able to compel an object to move without touching it, or blow on it, or using any outside help at all." Matilda nodded, but said nothing. "The fascinating thing," Miss Honey said, "would be to find out the real limit of this power of yours. Oh, I know you think you can move just about anything, but I have my doubts about that." "I'd love to try something really huge," Matilda said. "What about distance?" Miss Honey said. "Would you always have to be close to the thing you're pushing?" "I simply don't know," Matilda said, "but it would be fun to find out." Miss Honey's story. "We mustn't hurry this," Miss Honey said, "so let's have another cup of tea, and do eat that other slice of bread. You must be hungry." Matilda took the second slice and started eating it slowly. The margarine wasn't at all bad. She doubted whether she could have told the difference if she hadn't known. "Miss Honey," she said suddenly, do they pay you very badly at our school?" Miss Honey looked up sharply. "Not too badly," she said. "I get about the same as others, but it must still be very little if you are so dreadfully poor." Matilda said. "Do all the teachers live like this, with no furniture and no kitchen stove and no bathroom?" "No, they don't," Miss Honey said rather stiffly. "I just happen to be the exception." "I expect you just happen to like living in a very simple way," Matilda said, probing a little further. "It must make house cleaning an awful lot easier, and you don't have to furniture to polish, or any of those silly little ornaments lying around that have to be dusted every day. And I suppose if you don't have a fridge, you don't have to go out and buy all sorts of funky things like eggs and mayonnaise and ice cream to fill it all up with. It must save a terrific lot of shopping." At this point, Matilda noticed that Miss Honey's face had gone all tight and peculiar looking. Her whole body had become rigid. Her shoulders were hunched up high, and her lips were pressed together tight, and she sat there, gripping the mug of tea in both hands and staring down into it, as though searching for a way to answer these not quite so innocent questions. There followed a rather long and embarrassing silence. In the space of 30 seconds, the atmosphere in the tiny room had changed completely, and now it was vibrating with awkwardness and secrets. Matilda said, "I'm very sorry I asked you those questions, Miss Honey. It's not any of my business." At this, Miss Honey seemed to rouse herself. She gave a shake of her shoulders and then very carefully placed her mug on the tray. Why shouldn't you ask? She said. You are bound to ask in the end. You are much too bright not to have wondered. Perhaps I even wanted you to ask. Maybe that is why I invited you here after all. As a matter of fact, you are the first visitor to come to the cottage since I moved in 2 years ago. Matilda said nothing. She could feel the tension growing and growing in the room. You are so much wiser than your years, my dear, Miss Honey went on. That is that it quite staggers me. Although you look like a child, you are not really a child at all, because your mind and your powers of reasoning seem to be of a fully grown up person. So I suppose we might call you a grown up child, if you see what I mean. Matilda still did not say anything. She was waiting for what was coming next. Up to now, Miss Honey went on, I have found it impossible to talk to anyone about my problems. I couldn't face the embarrassment, and anyway, I lacked the courage. Any courage I had was knocked out of me when I was young. But now, all of a sudden, I have a sort of desperate wish to tell everything to somebody. I know you are only a little girl, but there is some kind of magic in you somewhere. I've seen it with my own eyes. Matilda became very alert. The voice, what she was hearing, was surely crying out for help. It must be. It had to be. Then the voice spoke again. Have some more tea, it said. I think there's still a drop left. Matilda nodded. Miss Honey poured tea into both mugs and added milk. Again she cupped her own mug in both hands and sat there sipping. There was quite a long silence before she said, May I tell you a story? Of course, Matilda said. I am 23 years old, Miss Honey said, and when I was born my father was a doctor in this village. We had a nice old house, quite large, red brick. It's tucked away in the woods behind the hills. I don't think you know it. Matilda kept silent. I was born there, Miss Honey said, and then came the first tragedy. My mother died when I was 2. My father, a busy doctor, had to have someone to run the house and look after me, so he invited my mother's unmarried sister, my aunt, to come and live with us, and she agreed, and she came. Matilda was listening. How old was the aunt when she moved in? She asked. Not very old, Miss Honey said. I should say about 30, but I hated her from the start. I missed my mother terribly, and the aunt was not a kind person. My father didn't know that because he was hardly ever around, but when he did put in an appearance, the aunt behaved differently. Miss Honey paused and sipped her tea. I can't think why I'm telling you this all, she said, embarrassed. Go on, Matilda said. Please. Well, Miss Honey said, then came the second tragedy. When I was 5, my father died very suddenly. One day he was there, and the next day he was gone, and so I was left to live alone with my aunt. She became my legal guardian. She had all the powers of a parent over me, and in some way or another she became the actual owner of the house. How did your father die? Matilda asked. It is interesting you should ask that, Miss Honey said. I myself was much too young to question it at the time, but I found out later there was a good deal of mystery surrounding his death. Didn't they know how he died? Matilda asked. Well, not exactly, Miss Honey said, hesitating. You see, no one could believe that he would ever have done it. He was such a very sane and sensible man. Done what? Matilda asked. Killed himself. Matilda was stunned. Did he? She gasped. That's what it looked like, Miss Honey said. But who knows? She shrugged and turned away and stared out of the tiny window. I know what you're thinking, Matilda said. You're thinking that the aunt killed him and made it look as though he'd done it himself. I'm not thinking anything, Miss Honey said. One must never think things like that without proof. The little room became quiet. Matilda noticed that the hands clasping the mug were trembling slightly. What happened after that? She asked. What happened when you were left all alone with the aunt? Wasn't she nice to you? Nice, Miss Honey said. She was a demon. As soon as my father was out of the way, she became a holy terror. My life was a nightmare. What did she do to you? Matilda asked. I don't want to talk about it, Miss Honey said. It's too horrible. But in the end, I became so frightened of her, I used to start shaking when she came into the room. You must understand, I was never a strong character like you. I was always shy and retiring. Didn't you have any other relations? Matilda said. Any uncles or aunts or grannies who would come and see you? None that I knew about, Miss Honey said. They were all either dead or they'd gone to Australia, and that's still the way it is now, I'm afraid. So you grew up in that house alone with your aunt, Matilda said. You must have gone to school. Of course, Miss Honey said. I went to the same school you're going to now, but I lived at home. Miss Honey paused and stared down into her empty tea mug. I think what I am trying to explain to you, she said, is that over the years I became so completely cowed and dominated by this monster of an aunt that when she gave me an order, no matter what it was, I obeyed it instantly. That can happen, you know. And by the time I was 10, I had become her slave. I did all the housework, I made her bed, I washed and I ironed for her. I did all the cooking, I learned how to do everything. But surely you could have complained to somebody, Matilda said. To whom? Miss Honey said. And anyway, I was far too terrified to complain. I told you I was her slave. Did she beat you? Let's not go into the details, Miss Honey said. How simply awful, Matilda said. Did you cry nearly all the time? Only when I was alone, Miss Honey said. I wasn't allowed to cry in front of her, but I lived in fear. What happened when you left school? Matilda asked. I was a bright pupil, Miss Honey said. I could easily have got into university, but there was no question. But there was no question of that. Why not, Miss Honey? Because I was needed at home to do the work. Then how did you become a teacher? Matilda asked. There, there is a teacher. There is a teacher training college in Reading, Miss Honey said. That's only 45 minutes bus ride away from here. I was allowed to go there on the condition I came straight home again every afternoon to do the washing and ironing, to clean the house and cook the supper. How old were you then? Matilda asked. When I went into the teacher's training, I was 18, Miss Honey said. You could have just packed up and walked away, Matilda said. Not until I got a job, Miss Honey said. And don't forget, I was I was by then dominated by my aunt so much to such an extent that I wouldn't have dared. You can't imagine what it's like to be completely controlled like that by a very strong personality. It turns you to jelly. So that's it. That's the sad story of my life. Now I've talked enough. Please don't stop, Matilda said. You haven't finished yet. How did you manage to get away from her in the end and come and live in this funny little house? Ah, that was something, Miss Honey said. I was proud of that. Tell me, Matilda said. Well, Miss Honey said, when I got back, when I got my teacher's job, the aunt told me I owed her a lot of money. I asked her why. She said, because I've been feeding you for all these years and buying you your shoes and your clothes. She told me it added up to thousands and I had to pay her back by giving her my salary for the next 10 years. I'll give you £1 a week pocket money, she said. That's all you're going to get. She even arranged with the school authorities to have my salary paid directly into her bank account. She made me sign the paper. You shouldn't have done that, Matilda said. Your salary was your chance of freedom. I know, Miss Honey said. But by then I had been her slave nearly all my life, and I hadn't the courage or the guts to say no. I was still petrified of her. She could still hurt me badly. So how did you manage to escape? Matilda asked. Ah, Miss Honey said, smiling for the first time. That was 2 years ago. It was my greatest triumph. Please tell me, Matilda said. I used to get up very early and go for walks while my aunt was still fast asleep, Miss Honey said, and one day I came across this tiny cottage. It was empty. I found out who owned it. It was a farmer. I went to see him. Farmers also get up very early. He was milking his cows. I asked him if I could rent his cottage. You can't live there, he cried. It's got no conveniences, no running water, no nothing. I want to live there, I said. I'm a romantic. I've fallen in love with it. Please rent it to me. You're mad, he said, but if you insist, you're welcome to it. The rent will be 10p a week. Here's 1 month in advance, I said, giving him 40p, and thank you so much. How super, Matilda cried. So suddenly you had a house all of your own. But how did you pluck up the courage to tell the aunt? That was tough, Miss Honey said, but I steeled myself to do it. One night after I cooked her supper, I went upstairs and packed up the few things I possessed in a cardboard box, came downstairs and announced I was leaving. I've rented a house, I said. My aunt exploded. Rented a house, she shouted. How can you rent a house when you only have £1 a week in the world? I've done it, I said. And how are you going to buy yourself food? I'll manage, I mumbled, and I rushed out of the front door. Oh, well done you, Matilda cried. So you were free at last? I was free at last, Miss Honey said. I can't tell you how wonderful it was. But have you really managed to live here on £1 a week for 2 years? Matilda asked. I most certainly have, Miss Honey said. I pay 10 pence a rent. I pay 10 pence rent, and then the rest just about buys me paraffin for my stove and for my lamp, and a little milk and tea and bread and margarine. That's all I need, really. As I told you, I have a jolly good tuck-in and the school lunch. Matilda stared at her. What a marvellously brave thing Miss Honey had done. Suddenly she had a heroine in Matilda's eyes. Isn't it awfully cold in the winter? She asked. I've got my little paraffin stove, Miss Honey said. You'll be surprised how snug I can make it in here. Do you have a bed, Miss Honey? Well, not exactly, Miss Honey said, smiling again, but they say it's very healthy to sleep on a hard surface. All at once, Matilda was able to see the whole situation with absolute clarity. Miss Honey needed help. There was no way she could go on existing like this indefinitely. You would be a lot better off, Miss Honey, she said, if you gave up your job and drew unemployment money. I would never do that, Miss Honey said. I love teaching. This awful Aunt Matilda said, I suppose she is still living in your very lovely old house. Very much so, Miss Honey said. She's still only about 50. She'll be around for a long time yet. And do you think your father really meant her to own the house forever? I'm quite sure he didn't, Miss Honey said. Parents will often give a guardian the right to occupy the house for a certain length of time, but it nearly always left in trust for the child. It then becomes the child's property when she or he grows up. Then surely it is your house, Matilda said. My father's will was never found, Miss Honey said. It looks as though somebody destroyed it. No prizes for guessing who, Matilda said. No prizes, Miss Honey said. But if there was no will, Miss Honey, then surely the house goes automatically to you. You are the next of kin. I know I am, Miss Honey said, but my aunt produced a piece of paper supposedly written by my father saying that he leaves the house to his sister-in-law in return for her kindness in looking after me. I am certain it's a forgery, but no one can prove it. Could you try? Matilda asked. Could you not hire a good lawyer and make a fight? I don't have the money for that, Miss Honey said, and you must remember that this aunt of mine is a much respected figure in the community. She has a lot of influence. Who is she? Miss Matilda said. Miss Honey hesitated a moment. Then she said softly, Miss Trunchbull. So Miss Honey is Miss Trunchbull's niece. Right, we'll read one more chapter. So the next chapter is called The Names. Miss Trunchbull, Matilda cried, jumping about a foot in the air. You mean she is your aunt? She brought you up? Yes, Miss Honey said. No wonder you were terrified, Matilda cried. The other day we saw her grab a girl by the pigtails and throw her over the playground fence. You haven't seen anything, Miss Honey said. After my father died when I was 5.5, she used to make me bath myself all alone. And she came up and thought I hadn't washed properly. She would push my head under the water and hold it there. But don't get me started on what she used to do. That won't help us at all. No, Matilda said, it won't. We came here, Miss Honey said, to talk about you, and I've been talking about myself. I've been talking about nothing but myself the whole time. I feel like a fool. I am much more interested in just how much you can do with your amazing eyes of yours. I can move things, Matilda said. I know I can. I can push things over. How would you like it, Miss Honey said, if we made some very cautious experiments just to see how much you can move and push? Quite surprisingly, Matilda said, if you don't mind, Miss Honey, I think I would rather not. I want to go home now and think about all the things I've heard this afternoon. Miss Honey stood up at once. Of course, she said, I've kept you far too long. Your mother will be starting to worry. She never does that, Matilda said, smiling, but I would like to go home now, please, if you don't mind. Come along then, Miss Honey said. I'm sorry I gave you such a rotten tea. You didn't do it at all, Matilda said. I loved it. The two of them walked all the way to Matilda's house in complete silence. Miss Honey sensed that Matilda wanted it that way. The child seemed so lost in thought that she hardly looked where she was walking, and when they reached the gate of Matilda's home, Miss Honey said, You'd better forget everything I told you this afternoon. I won't promise to do that, Matilda said, but I will promise not to talk about it to anyone any more, not even to you. I think that would be wise, Miss Honey said. I won't promise to stop thinking about it, though, Miss Honey, Matilda said. I've been thinking about it all the way back from your cottage, and I believe I've got just a tiny little bit of an idea. You mustn't, Miss Honey said. Please forget it. I would like to ask you 3 last things before I stop talking about it, Matilda said. Please will you answer them, Miss Honey? Miss Honey smiled. It was extraordinary. She told herself how this little snippet of a girl seemed suddenly to be taking charge of her problems, and with such authority too. Well, she said, that depends on what the questions are. The first thing is, Matilda said, what did Miss Trunchbull call your father when they were around the house at home? I'm sure she called him Magnus, Miss Honey said. That was his first name. And what did your father call Miss Trunchbull? Her name is Agatha, Miss Honey said. That's what he would call her. And lastly, Matilda said, what did your father and Miss Trunchbull call you around the house? They would call me Jenny, Miss Honey said. Matilda pondered these answers very carefully. Let me make sure I've got them right, she said. In the house at home, your father was Magnus, Miss Trunchbull was Agatha, and you were Jenny. Am I right? That is correct, Miss Honey said. Thank you, Matilda said, and now I won't mention the subject any more. Miss Honey wondered what on earth was going on in the mind of this child. Don't do anything silly, she said. Matilda laughed and turned away and ran up the path to the front door, calling out as she went, Goodbye, Miss Honey. Thank you so much for the tea. Right, so we've got page 204, and we're going up to, let's see, not many pages left to go. I think there's only one more read left, maybe. One more chapter left. Right, so I just want to show you something because I quite like it and I think you'll like it too. I want to show you my office. Are you ready? Here it is. So in here is my office. It's a bit cramped. Got Nikki's dressing table there. And then look, I quite like the old plant or two. So we've got these plants here. And we've got these plants. And we've got these plants. And we've got these plants. We've got these plants. We've got these plants. We've got this plant here. It's reaching out for some light. And look what we've got on here. So I can see this when I'm doing my work. You did that in your house and I brought it home and bought a frame for it. And we've got more plants, more plants, more plants. And then here, look, we've got this one here, which is a picture of you and me when I came to your house. And Nikki made that, which was kind of her. And then here, look at this. It says Akira. And it's got like a big like planet or something, or some sort of meteor, and it's like, you know, I think it's to do with the like new day, isn't it, like Akira. So I've got that, and so yeah, this is where I work and this is where I write, and yeah, I just wanted to show you that. So that's my office, and then you know this picture, my favourite picture. Well, I hope you enjoyed the reading, and I'll speak to you again soon. I love you lots. Bye.